A very good afternoon and also very good morning to our viewers and participants, and welcome to the online discussion, A Multilateral Future, Ireland, the European Union and the United Nations. And may I wish to all the Irish participants a happy Bloomsday. This event is jointly organized by the European Movement Ireland and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. My name is Matthias Byrne. I'm representing the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in the United Kingdom and Ireland. This is a second in a three-parts series of events on the issues and opportunities that impact Ireland, the EU, and their global relationships. So I'm pleased to welcome our three distinguished speakers today, based all from over the globe, starting with Ambassador Geraldine Byrne. She is the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations, based in New York. So it's a very early morning for you in New York, Ambassador, and we are very grateful having you. Then welcome to Francis Fitzgerald, member of the European Parliament and Vice Chair of the EPP Group, so the European People's Party Group in the European Parliament, and a former Taoiseach, so a former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland. And last but not least, welcome to Ben Tonra. He is a professor of international relations at the University College in Dublin. And a very good morning or good afternoon also to you, Noel O'Connell, CEO of the European Movement Ireland, who will again chair today's discussion. And there is plenty to discuss. The G7 leaders met last week for the first time in almost 2 years due to the pandemic. There was a lot of coverage before, during, and after the summit in Cornwall. And there was one overwhelming message perceiving this G7 summit as a long-wished vital sign of multilateralism. A vital sign of multilateralism, of course, in a very challenging geopolitical environment. But the Biden presidency has renewed America's commitment, and the European Union and its member states continue to defend and advance principles of global cooperation. We are 6 months on from Ireland taking its seat on the UN Security Council. For the past 2 years, Germany has been a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and Minister Simon Coveney attended the symbolic handover in Berlin last year in 2020. And he said, Ireland and Germany are unwavering supporters of the United Nations and multilateralism. We believe the Security Council has a vital role to play in preventing and resolving conflict. End quote. And I can only fully underline this, especially on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, a German political foundation, a Christian democratic foundation, committed to European values and a rule-based international order. And allow me to mention that our foundation has among the 100 bases worldwide, not only a European office in Brussels, but also 3 offices engaged in multilateral dialogue in New York, in Vienna, and in Geneva. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. I will now hand over to Noel, and we are very happy to cooperate with the European Movement Ireland on this regular basis. Many thanks again, Noel, and the floor is yours.
Danke, Matthias, and thank you very much for your very warm words of welcome and good morning and good afternoon. It is past 12 o'clock, so it is here in Dublin, and special thanks to obviously Ambassador Geraldine Byrne, who's joining us at a very early time for her. So it is good morning to Geraldine in New York. And thank you, Matthias, for wishing us all Bloomsday. I know the Irish embassies and the Department of Foreign Affairs through their international networks are very actively celebrating and commemorating this very special day. And hopefully in the not too distant future, more physical and in-person events will be able to take place to mark this special day. So we're delighted to see another virtual full house for today's event, A Multilateral Future, Ireland, the EU and the UN. As CEO of European Movement Ireland, our organisation is about dialogue, engaging and constructive debate, and we're delighted to be partnering with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung on this series of conversations and events. So today we're going to be providing global perspectives on issues and opportunities that impact on the EU and on our global relationships, examining the importance of multilateralism and the rules-based international order from the perspectives of both the EU and the UN. And to that end, we have a fantastic and distinguished and very expert panel of speakers joining us today to deliver their insights and share some thoughts on this important and timely topic. First of all, we are delighted to be joined by Frances Fitzgerald MEP, who is Vice Chair of the EPP Group in the European Parliament. And Frances is also former Taoiseach, a former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland. And Frances is joining us today from Dublin. And then also delighted to be joined by Ambassador Geraldine Byrne. Geraldine is the permanent representative of Ireland to the UN and is well known to all of us. And lastly, but by no means least, delighted to be joined from beautiful Mayo, I think you mentioned, Ben, by Professor Ben Tonra, Professor of International Relations at University College Dublin School of Politics and International Relations. So in terms of proceedings and the running order for today's event, I'll be giving the floor very shortly to our distinguished panel of speakers who will in turn provide opening remarks. After that point, we will have a discussion with the panel followed by an interactive Q&A. And we've already got some questions in, which is fantastic to see. So please do, to those of you watching us, don't hesitate to send in any questions or comments you'd like the panel to address by emailing events@europeanmovement.ie or on social media using the hashtag EMICAS. And my colleagues are at hand monitoring our social media channels and will feed your questions to me. And if you are tweeting, please use the handles @EMIreland and @CAS_UK Ireland. So our first speaker today, who will be setting the scene for us very aptly and very appropriately, is Ambassador Geraldine Byrne. Geraldine has been the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations since August 2017, and immediately prior to that, she was Ambassador of Ireland to France and Monaco. During her distinguished career in the Department of Foreign Affairs, she has served in Brussels, New York, Paris, Vienna and Helsinki, and also served as Second Secretary General in the Department of the Taoiseach or Prime Minister. She was previously Deputy Perm Rep to the EU and Director of the National Forum on Europe. Since her arrival in New York, Ambassador Byrne led Ireland's successful campaign for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, and she now leads the Security Council team at the Irish mission for the 2021 to 2022 term. So she's incredibly busy and it's a very early start for her. So Geraldine, delighted to have you join us, and I hand over the virtual floor to you in New York. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Noelle, and a big thank you, Danke, to Matthias also. I'm thrilled to be here speaking to you, even if it is early morning. I'm delighted to be in the honourable company of Frances Fitzgerald and Ben Tonra. In addition, Matthias, to today being Bloomsday, and thank you for the greetings. I have to say it's a very special day for me also, because tomorrow marks 1 year to the day exactly since Ireland was elected to the UN Security Council. And I can assure you that the intervening period, preparations, and then stepping on to the Council of what now, as you say, is our 6-month mark, has been pretty extraordinary. I think it's fair to say that having a place at the top table of diplomacy has certainly been a deep dive all around, not just for those of us in New York, for the amazing team in Dublin and right across the Irish missions globally. For me, of course, personally, a personal privilege, professional honour to be leading the team in New York at the Council. It's a responsibility you see that the Irish government takes very seriously. You have seen that from the very strong and visible engagement of everyone across government, from our Taoiseach through to, of course, Foreign Minister Simon Coveney and all other ministers in the Cabinet. The day-to-day reality at that iconic horseshoe table is, of course, a very grown-up one, I could say. It's largely grappling with devastating, protracted crises like Syria and Yemen, with sudden outbreaks of bitter, tragic conflict like we saw just last month in Gaza, and again, of course, uneasiness and violence there overnight. The Council, of course, also strives to cope with newer threats like the COVID-19 pandemic and to somehow settle itself around emerging threats to peace and security, such as climate security and cybersecurity, on which I have to say we haven't actually yet found our overall approach. The daily debate at the Council is backed up by very close engagement with UN organizations, other member states, and of course, absolutely with civil society. So together, working essentially to resolve crises that are just far too complex and difficult to tackle alone. And that's the essence of multilateralism, after all. Conflicts we're dealing with often beget humanitarian tragedies that know no borders, and they need collective answers. And clearly, absent multilateral solutions, we see that answers don't arise to the major issues we're dealing with. We can, just by way of two quick examples, the reduced access and needed access to vaccines globally currently, and of course, an insufficient climate action response. Two examples where without multilateral action, we simply won't deliver. We're one of 15 council members now for this 2-year tenure, but of course we came from the General Assembly, where we were one of 193 members of the Assembly. I often say that Ireland sort of grew up in the General Assembly. I think Irish foreign policy certainly came of age there. And when I sit at the Security Council table, I'm very conscious that Ireland carries with us the representative role for all of those who elected us to the Security Council table. And also, I would say, not just a role to reflect their concerns, but also hopefully to live up to and deliver on their expectations. I mean, Ireland has always held a strong conviction that collective multilateral engagement enhances our sovereignty rather than diminishes it. And I believe this is true for all nations, whether they're small islands like Ireland, large, powerful countries like Germany, or indeed global superpowers. And I must say, sitting at the Security Council every day alongside global giants like China, India, the US, that's set in some relief by the presence and the influence of the smallest ever member state elected to the Security Council, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They have a population of just 120,000 people. They sit as a voting member of the Security Council. Next year, as a representative of the Latin American group, they will be replaced by Brazil with a population of 211 million people. So I say that by way of illustration that the Security Council also respects the way the multilateral system works, where size doesn't always reflect solely the influence that one can deliver. Now, multilateralism at the heart of Ireland's work as a member of the Security Council is in our DNA, I think, because of our European Union membership. And as High Representative Borrell said recently at the Security Council, the demand for multilateral solutions is greater than the supply. As a proud member of the European Union, Ireland understands the power of cooperation among diverse nations to meet common challenges. That's something I think that makes us a better member of the Security Council, just as Germany and other EU members have experienced. Our work at the European Union table finely tunes a country like Ireland for the necessary capabilities at the Council table, to be agile, to be flexible, to be in a position to guide Security Council debate towards solutions, and of course, importantly then, to shape the outcomes. On the Council, Ireland's EU partners, we have 2 partners on the Council at the moment, France, a permanent member, and Estonia, the other elected member. Of course, they're our closest partners. We don't always march in lockstep, but we walk a common path guided by the same principles and values Matthias referred to at the beginning. And we are committed, above all, to dialogue and to peace building. Norway elected alongside us, very like-minded, so a member of the European family at the table. And just 3 years ago, as Matthias pointed out, we actually had not just Germany, but we had 5 EU member states pre-Brexit. We had the UK, France, Germany, Belgium, and Poland serving at the table. So a third of the Security Council membership was European. Today we have 3, and just next year, France and Ireland will be home alone, as it were, as European members of the Security Council. But the EU as a global influence gives us a huge springboard at the Security Council table. The largest provider, of course, the EU of development assistance, means that we're represented in 140 countries. And for the 3 elected African members, for example, on the Security Council, I think the European Union's work on the continent of Africa, constructive engagement in major African peacekeeping missions, for example, I can mention AMISOM, big mission, underwriting stability, and sometimes protecting the fragility in Somalia, very important. We just had a debate this week on the role of the peacekeeping missions, which the EU participates in Mali. And of course, the new European Peace Facility, providing a really important role across the continent of Africa in peacekeeping and peace building. I mention Africa in particular as it's 60% of the agenda of the Security Council focuses on Africa. I also want to say that scale in terms of European engagement creates political space for us. The development support from the European Union and its member states amounted to half of all the total global assistance in 2019. So I see the EU as a direct player and contributor in that sense to the maintenance of international peace and security. And the EU, we shouldn't forget, and its member states are also the single largest financial contributor to the UN system. So properly speaking, the EU underwrites UN action in war-torn regions from Afghanistan to Sudan, Syria to Haiti and Yemen. And the contributions, of course, are not just financial. Every day at the Security Council table, the influence of the European Union is tangible, ensuring the rules-based world order is upheld, that human rights are promoted and protected, and that dialogue and political solutions to conflict are actually central to our work and to our responses. And that takes place at the highest levels. Just last week, we heard from the High Representative Borrell on the strong EU-UN partnership, and the UN Secretary General will actually attend the next European Council discussion about how we can, as it were, better dock together EU-UN, really important positive step in my view. And I can say without any fear of contradiction that our shared EU priorities are really Ireland's North Star when we're at the table negotiating resolutions, statements, solutions, whether that's on Yemen or DRC as it was yesterday. The EU set of traditional EU values and principles guide us. No exaggeration to say that the most complex crisis we're currently facing, COVID-19, really underline that need for collaborative commitment, and the central role the EU is playing there with the UN as a major donor to COVAX underlines our commitments. We're also, I think, seen at the table of the Security Council as EU as a strong action-oriented partner, and there's where peacekeeping missions, really one of the most important and visible functions of the Council, comes into play. 13 of the EU's 17 missions work alongside UN missions. And as a peacekeeping nation with over 60 years experience of unbroken service, we're really proud to see the Irish Blue Helmets working alongside EU partners in EU missions. And when we're not keeping the peace, we're actually building it. So together with our EU partners, Ireland has supported mediation and peace processes in Colombia, Afghanistan, Georgia, Mozambique. And as EU Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia, Ireland's former Taoiseach and Foreign Minister Eamon Gilmore represented the EU while bringing lessons learned from Ireland's own peace process to the table. I often think that that's a process that's a perfect example of what we're discussing here this morning, bringing together the political weight of the EU, the Irish lived experience, and the UN facilitated process, all coming together in a peace building effort. So as I come to conclude my remarks, I want to point out one or two last aspects of this. The EU now a very topical issue, a member of the Middle East Peace Process Quartet, facilitator also of the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, and coordinator of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Ireland on the Security Council is facilitator for the Iran nuclear deal, Resolution 2231, and we assist the Council in upholding this important agreement. And in that, just one key role I can point to, where we're busy here in New York on a daily basis, as is Foreign Minister Coveney, as the guardian of that nuclear deal with Iran. We both directly and indirectly support the work of the European Union as the coordinator of the JCPOA, and of course the chair of the Vienna negotiations, which wants to put that critical diplomatic agreement back on the rails. Finally, I believe that Ireland is really lucky to be on the Security Council at a time when the United States is experiencing a renewed commitment to multilateralism. I'm saying that as we watch the important meeting between President Biden and Mr. Putin today. We in recent days have seen the US again espouse European values. I work very closely here with my American counterpart, Linda Thomas Greenfield. And while it's a pleasure to have America back on the world stage, what's more important, of course, is how the return has created a more enabling environment for Ireland and our European partners to pursue shared priorities at the Council. Climate change, climate security, I mentioned as a good example of European priority, and where the US has now returned as an ally at the table. I'll finish by saying, of course, that the EU member, as an EU member of the Council, we also have to grapple with some of the EU's more challenging relationships, for example, that with Russian Federation and sometimes with China. Just last month, Ireland joined the other Council members in calling for a Council discussion on the forced landing of a Ryanair flight in Belarus. And with China, Ireland has also worked on trying to support Council discussions on Myanmar, where, of course, China's own role as a big regional power defines its approach there. We also saw before joining the Council discussions in Hong Kong. So it's not always plain sailing. But I think at the end, the relationship between these partners and our EU vocation brings us along. So pointing all over to a complex landscape here in New York as we work to pursue both national and European priorities at the table. And suffice to say, 6 months in, we're continuing to fight the good fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, Ambassador, for that outstanding contribution. I think you've managed to cover not only the breadth and range of activities that you and your team and colleagues back at base and HQ in Dublin are involved in, but also that ambition and that shared collective partnership, not only at a national level, but also at an EU level and in partnership with the wider UN global family. I can see why when we originally invited Geraldine to speak with us, she said, let's give it a couple of months until I've the feet under the table because I'll be a bit busy. And I think after listening to your keynote address, Geraldine, I can certainly see why that is the case. So thank you very much. Fantastic. And now delighted to very nicely segue on to the EU aspect of our topic today. Our next distinguished speaker for today's event, Frances Fitzgerald, who was elected as a Fine Gael MEP for Dublin in the 2019 European Parliament elections. And previously, she was a member of the Oireachtas of the Parliament here and served as Taoiseach, or Deputy Prime Minister, one of only 4 women to have ever held this position in Ireland. Frances has also held several cabinet positions, including Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation, Minister for Justice and Equality, and she was the very first Minister for Children and Youth Affairs. Frances is a full member of the European Parliament's Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee, the Economic Monetary Affairs Committee, and a substitute member of the Development Committee and Committee on Foreign Interference in all domestic processes in the EU, including disinformation. And in March 2021, she was elected a Vice President of the European People's Party Group in the European Parliament. Frances, a very warm welcome to you, and you have the virtual floor.
Thanks very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Noel, and good afternoon, Matthias. And delighted to be invited at this very interesting time to discuss multilateralism and to be involved with the European movement and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. I think if ever a picture spoke 1,000 words, it's the picture that we saw of the G7 and the various pictures that have emerged over the last few days with President Joe Biden's visit to the UK and the EU. Of course, I also see the lack of women in those pictures, and that reminds me of the long journey we have ahead of us if women are to play the kind of role at the top leadership positions in the world that we absolutely need to in order to have an inclusive society at every level. And of course, there are always exceptions. And Geraldine, well done. It was always my pleasure to work with you when I was Taoiseach and Minister for Business, and great to see the incredible work that you're doing in New York at present, and delighted to have heard what you've had to say in the very broad canvas that you've painted in relation to multilateralism and Ireland's role in particular. Let me begin by making some comments on multilateralism. And it is a fascinating time to be speaking about it. And of course, multilateralism really emerged after the Second World War, but it has evolved. And I think the important point to make is that it is not static. It evolves and depends on the particular economic, social and political context. And by goodness, do we see that at present in relation to both the EU's role in relation to China and also in relation to America, and I will comment on that at a later point. But let me just say that I do believe that multilateralism has to be and is the foundation of the international system, indeed of international governance, you could say. But I said it has evolved. It has evolved to include more actors. It was seen as states, but of course, increasingly we see it as many other actors and players. We see it as NGOs being involved around the world. Indeed, we see it as the private sector. We see it as perhaps increasingly companies. And I think it's very interesting to reflect on multilateralism in that way. And of course, we see that in the very famous UN conferences, whether they're on climate or gender or whatever, we see that very rich engagement. And I suppose I see it in the EU all of the time as well. And I marvel, in fact, at the engagement I see in the EU across the member states and the way it does its work and reaches consensus. And one can only imagine the challenges of meeting work in the Security Council with ever more and increased numbers. I think the past 20 years have been pretty turbulent on the global stage. I think the 90s, perhaps, there was a false sense of security. We saw various peace processes moving ahead, major conflicts ending. But I think now we see increasingly some old models of global politics rearing their heads again, strongman politics, authoritarian tendencies on the rise. The chatter, if you like, of superpowers, the race to power and might. And we've seen whether it's the Donald Trumps, the Putins, the Erdogans, we see this happening. But of course, as Geraldine said, COVID-19 pandemic has added a whole new dimension and complexity to global politics. But it has also demonstrated, like nothing else, I think, how interconnected we are and how we have to tackle so many problems through global cooperation. Last year, on the 75th anniversary of the UN, the world's heads of state and government issued an important declaration which emphasized multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity as we build back better for a more equal, a more resilient and more sustainable world. And I think that's a message that continues to resonate. The recovery from COVID is not worth fighting for if it is uneven, unequal or unsustainable. And I think for too long, multilateralism has been thought of as primarily through the lens of economic progress. But now it must be really reoriented towards a resilient, a digital, an equal, I would say, sustainable, and I would also add caring society and social concerns being taken more and more into account, and our citizens, what the actual experience of day-to-day life is like. Geraldine has spoken in detail about Ireland's commitment, and I won't elaborate on that, just to say that our peacekeeping, and I come from an army family myself, just to say that our peacekeeping, I believe, has given us an incredible sense of multilateralism, of engagement in the world, of really the role that Ireland can and must and should play, and that unique role as a small country that we can and do play. You may remember that famous Economist article of 2020, which said that on a per head basis, Ireland has a good claim to be the world's most diplomatically powerful country. What a compliment. But certainly we must use our influence for human rights, no question of that. Let me say from an EU perspective, we have a very challenging perspective at present, in the sense that we, in the face of increasing confrontation between major powers and growing unilateralism, the EU has consistently been one of the biggest champions of a rules-based multilateral system. We've seen the democracies within Europe, indeed, come under strain, but of course also outside. But of course, we simply cannot simply disengage where there are violations of human rights, democracy, or international trade. Let me take when it comes to China. This is a difficult situation for business, who rely heavily on trade and supply, given the huge increase in trade in recent years. In 2020, China became the main EU trading partner for goods, overtaking the US. And that relationship is one that is constantly evolving. And I would say it's at a very worrying point at this stage in terms of our attitudes and our understanding of what's happening with human rights in China. And as China would appear to withdraw from human rights, so that EU relationship, whether it is the political or the business trade relationship, comes under increasing stress. Not an easy geopolitical situation for us all to find ourselves in, one America is very concerned about as well. So I think we also in the EU have to continually, renew and reaffirm our own relevance as an international organization and its benefit to the daily life of our citizens. The Conference on the Future of Europe is going to be an important marker of how we relate to our citizens and how the EU will evolve in dealing with these challenges. There's quite a lot of tension in the Parliament at the moment in terms of what sanctions we use in relation to these breaches of human rights around the world and how far we should go. Let me say, in relation to the EU-US, clearly there's a high level of trust on both sides of the Atlantic. The EU-US relationship is seen as reliable. There is a consensus on taking a tougher stance on global issues like climate change, human rights, and data protection. It's clearly a huge agreement on ending the pandemic and sharing everything we can. Rebuilding the economies with workers in mind is something we share. Interestingly, to see the Biden administration putting care at the center of their recovery plans, EU also moving in that direction. And we have found a common policy to stand strong against disinformation and human rights. And I think we have seen the increase of that message transatlantically. We are going to address Russia, I believe, with a strong position, as will happen really in this very important week as well. So I think there's lots of room for, coordination and developing the relationship, tackling those macroeconomic problems. Before I finish, let me make a quick comment about gender. I want to speak about gender and multilateralism. I don't think many see the obvious link, but I think that's changing and I think it's crucial. Globally, insofar as women's rights are concerned, there's a huge cause for concern. Yet gender equality issues are mentioned only peripherally when foreign affairs are discussed at the highest level. Gender equality is rarely mentioned in high-level communications after summits. Rather, defense and strategic geopolitical interests take center stage. But gender equality is at the core. If we want to build our democracies, the role of women in those democracies is critical, and how we treat women is a very interesting marker of democracy. I would also say that those who violate women's rights are not good partners from a multilateral perspective. We see this again and again. I don't have time to give the examples. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, widely shared around the world and seen as critical, the goal number 5 on gender equality, again, everyone agrees if that can be dealt with, it will have increasingly broader impacts. So I think issues like the Spotlight Initiative between the UN, the EU, 500 million input from the EU to tackle domestic violence during COVID, right across the globe, is a very interesting example of the kind of actions that we can see from a multilateral perspective in relation to gender. I mention it because it so rarely gets the priority that it needs to get when we are having these discussions. Look, we need to work hard to maintain our democracies. I heard a human rights campaigner saying recently that only 14% of countries around the world, that's 1/4, really have fully developed democracies. I always say they're unfinished, but we must work hard to protect our liberal democracies, to continue our multilateralism and protect human rights. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Frances, for that tour de force and outstanding contribution, outlining, as you did, very, very eloquently, the importance of multilateralism and the role that gender equality certainly plays in that. And you have always been a champion and an advocate for that. So thank you very much, Frances. Just before we turn to Ben for his contribution, if I might just take this opportunity to remind our audience to feel free to send in any questions to events@europeanmovement.ie or post them on social media using the hashtag EMICAS. And now I'm delighted to invite our final set of opening remarks, to invite Professor Ben Tonra, Professor of International Relations at UCD and Vice Principal for Internationalization and Global Engagement at UCD's College of Social Sciences and Law. Professor Tonra teaches, researches and publishes extensively on European foreign security and defence policy, Irish foreign security and defence policy and international relations theory. So he's ideally placed to speak with us today. Outside of his role in UCD, Ben is also a very active member of the Royal Irish Academy and previously served as the chair of the Academy's Standing Committee on International Affairs, and he is a project leader for a research programme in EU security and defence policy at the Institute of International and European Affairs. And as an avid follower and admirer of him on Twitter, I always welcome his insights and his musings on Twitter on many topics. Ben, delighted to invite you to deliver your address. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Noelle, and musings is always the right word for Twitter. Can I thank both the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and, of course, yourselves at European Movement Ireland for the kind invitation, and it's a real privilege, I have to say, to be speaking alongside such two strong leaders representing Ireland internationally at the UN and in the European Union. I think where I want to come from, we've had sort of the broad analysis of Ireland at the UN. We've looked at the EU. I want to focus my remarks perhaps a little bit more on Ireland specifically and Ireland's specific role through those two institutions. I think genuinely Ireland stands at a real turning point in terms of its foreign policy history. I mean, we've always been driven by a commitment to the rule of law, collective security, and multilateral institutions. That's always part of our DNA as a foreign policy actor. But really, this is an historical moment where Ireland has to double down on that tradition and redouble its efforts in the defence of multilateralism and in the defence of many of the values which underpin the multilateral order that has served us for the last 40, 50 years. And I would emphasize that that's not just a principled position. That's not just a principle of a good thing. It's also deeply in Ireland's self-interest, because as a small state, we can only rely on the force of law if we're not to be subject to the law of force. So there's not just principle, but there's also pragmatism and real self-interest involved in terms of Ireland's dedication to multilateralism and the values that are associated with it. And one of the things that, speaking with some of the colleagues of the ambassador in terms of our current UNSC membership, one of the striking features is how often they're having to defend existing policy from those who would like to pull back from some of the advances that the UN has made over the last year. So it's almost less of an effort to make new advances at the UN than to defend principles that the UN has well established, because we are in a very, very challenging historical moment in terms of new geopolitical balances, in terms of the rise of overtly authoritarian powers, and some determined attempts by those powers to undermine many of the values that underpin the contemporary global order. And I think Ireland has a unique perspective to share, and indeed a unique responsibility to act. And we've heard of that both from the ambassador and from Frances Fitzgerald, of how hard we have to act to defend those values and defend those interests. The one wrinkle to that I'd add, though, is that we also have to defend those values at home if we're to have credibility defending those values overseas. And when I say at home, I say within the European Union's own context, and some of our member states who are challenging some of those values and are moving down more authoritarian pathways. And that's a real challenge I know that the European Union faces. And I know it's a real challenge that Francis Fitzgerald and others have grappled with in the European Parliament, but it's a serious challenge and one that has to be met head on. We also, therefore, also have to think about those challenges in some of the darker corners of our own national politics. Social media, and these things do need to be addressed. The other point, I'm sorry, is the broadcast okay?
Yes, I think, Ben, we just lost you momentarily. So, yep, but you're fine. You're back with us now. So, carry on.
There's a cost to being in Mayo sometimes in terms of connectivity. I would like to highlight one final thing, and that is with respect to Ireland's traditions and in respect of our activities. One of the things that we have to note, and this is something that I've written about most recently, one of the things we have to note is there's sometimes a gap between the rhetoric that we apply and the resources that we deploy, both as an practice, as I say, resources where they need to be. If we look at our development aid policy, if we look at our foreign policy, if we look at our defense and security policy, we are sometimes slow to put in the resources necessary to give credence and credibility to those policies. I think we've done a huge amount in the last number of years, particularly in the area of foreign affairs, in extending our diplomatic network, in extending the strength of our diplomatic personnel, and in being ambitious. And we have an opportunity in respect of defense and in respect of the defense forces with the new commission on the defence force. Not only the truth of Ireland's contribution to international security can be made much stronger. So I think there's a lot that we can accomplish. There's a lot we have accomplished in areas such as development cooperation. But one appeal I would make in conclusion is that we need to back that up with the resources, with a political will, and with a commitment on the part of the Irish peace that they put in office and give them the resources to fulfill the mandate, which is both a mandate of principle in terms of Irish foreign security defence policy, but also a mandate that reflects the practical interests of Ireland in a very difficult and increasingly challenged international world.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben, for that. I think we had some slight technical broadband issues, perhaps outlining, as ever, the importance of the digital agenda of the EU. So, Francis, I think we definitely need to work on that at an EU and a national level to beautiful Mayo. So, what I might do, Ben, if it's okay, I might leave my technical colleagues tic-tac with you in terms of maybe you possibly logging back out and back in, and I might go with some of the questions that have come in so far. I think a couple in for Francis and Geraldine, and then I'll have your ones ready in a second if that's okay. So Francis, I might just turn to you if I may first, and an interesting question in here for you, Francis, from Peter. I'm just wondering, do the panelists, and Geraldine, feel free to join in on this question after Francis, but do the panelists think it will benefit the European Union to help the UN mature as Europe did after World War II?
Just repeat that question again.
So do the panelists think it will benefit the European Union? So will it be of benefit to the EU to help the UN mature and develop as Europe did after World War II?
I'm not sure what assumptions that question is coming from in relation to the UN or the EU, but let me say that I absolutely think we have so much to gain from one another and so much to learn. I think if you take climate change, for example, it has been fascinating to see the leadership at EU level. I mean, it really has been a leader. It's a leader in many areas. It's a leader in equality around the world, actually. It's not a leader in some other areas. And one of the points I would make about Europe that we're quite concerned about is how innovation often, particularly digital AI and so on, escapes from Europe, and that we do not keep our innovation in Europe and thus harm our economies, and that there is a real need for us to very much work on that issue and see what we can do to improve it. I think the engagement with the UN and the EU, and I think Geraldine has many examples of it. If you take the new Medici program in Africa, for example, I mean, the support we can give to countries across the world from the EU in development aid, in a partnership model, and so on, working with the UN, I think there's amazing scope there. And I think really one of the issues is that probably people don't know enough about it. I mean, COVAX is another place at present where I think the scope for engagement with countries. The EU, again, has been a leader in terms of supplying the vaccine to, I think it's 45 of the less well-developed countries, for example, where the waiver, it has been granted. People don't even realize that, but where we've had so much export as well. So I think, yes, I mean, the EU, I think it can be an even stronger player in the UN. And I'd be interested whether Geraldine feels there's some need perhaps for even structural change in terms of the representation of the EU at the UN. And that might be an interesting place for us to go on this question, Noelle.
Thanks, Frances. Geraldine, did you want to come in on that point?
I did, and thanks picking up on Frances, particularly her structural reference there. If I may, to start with, as a member of the Security Council, say that we fought very hard to be elected. We're thrilled to get here, but we think it's anachronistic structurally. So when I think of the maturing of the UN, I also think of the actual Security Council, which is really at the heart of the international peace and security structure. That, we have 5 permanent members who are post Second World War powers. Big questions around how representative they are. But I would also say that an increasingly evolutionary way of working at the council that is good news in the sense that elected members, and of course you always have 10 elected members, and we are one of them right now. Elected members are playing an increasingly influential role. So I think pushing the boundaries a bit. Frances picked up on climate, for example, as an issue that the UN is grappling with. I mentioned in my remarks climate security, contested by some P5 members as a legitimate issue for discussion at the council table, but by and large hugely supported by the elected members. So I see the elected members as more progressive typically than the permanent members who are more interested in a status quo. And certainly Minister Simon Coveney during our campaign very well reflected our concerns about the use of the veto on the Security Council, because of course we see that as a big impediment really, and that's the only way you can put it, to the business of the council. And we would certainly like to see an expanded council. We believe Africa in particular has a historic injustice in not having a bigger and a permanent representation at the council, but we wouldn't favour it that new members of the council have a veto. When it comes to the role of the European Union, Frances, I think that's an interesting open question that is definitely something that I know anyone from Germany listening to this will know must have arisen during the German tenure on the Security Council. We have France as a permanent member now, the UK no longer part of the European Union. So we, as I said to you, we will come down next year to just 2 European member states on the Security Council. It's a live debate. I've heard particularly German colleagues raise it very often. Should there be a European seat, for example? I know as ambassador, ex-ambassador to France and close partner here with my French colleagues, they have very different views. And it's a very complex question because, of course, even within the 27 EU member states at any single European Council, and certainly France is in the Parliament, sees the complexity of coming to agreement, particularly on difficult foreign policy issues from the Middle East through to conflicts I mentioned raging in Africa. So I think it's a legitimate question. It's something we should consider. And Ireland is open to a discussion very much about the role of the Security Council in international peace and security and how representative the post-war structure is or how unrepresentative it is and how we can take that forward. I'll finish talking too much here, but I'll finish by saying it's a very difficult discussion in the UN. We participate in an intergovernmental negotiation on restructuring, very difficult. We've had more success in the General Assembly, and France has mentioned that, around the Sustainable Development Goals. That's been a more sort of progressive environment for discussion than the structural discussions in the Security Council.
Great, thank you, Geraldine. And Ben, good to see you. You're more clearly defined on my screen now, which is fantastic. So Ben, I might actually one question is coming in to you, just in terms of security and peacekeeping, and something obviously that we are very proud of, justifiably, as both Francis and Geraldine have mentioned in Ireland. But there is always this question of when to act in a way that prevents violence in the first place, or in a way that prevents violence from reoccurring. What, Ben, would you see as the role of security and peacekeeping in underpinning the future of multilateralism, as you mentioned? And how can organizations such as the G7 and informal groupings contribute to this role? And how can we make them more representative of the world we live in today?
I think it's a really good question, and it's an important one to bear in mind, that a lot of the credibility of the multilateral system rests on its ability to address the big issues and the big questions. And Geraldine and Francis have already mentioned, climate, sustainability. These are big global challenges that the multilateral system has to meet. At a lesser level, but immediately important to many of the populations involved, is the international community's ability to address crises. Not just to deal with the crisis once it's broken, ideally to prevent the crisis developing in terms of socioeconomic aid, in terms of political reaction to diplomatic disputes, but then in the final analysis, when the bullets are flying, the ability of the international community to react. There we have a real problem, because as the ambassador has already mentioned, there are certain realities of the Security Council which impinge on decision making on the UN. The UN itself has been unable, because its member states are unable or unwilling, to devote resources and attention to creating a stronger UN ability to intervene in security terms. So the UN now tends to subcontract security to the African Union, to the European Union, to NATO, to other multilateral organizations. So the UN is critical as legitimator of those actions, but it's very often up to the regional organizations to actually put the people on the ground. And there, I think Ireland's contribution in an EU context is really, really important. We have to have structures and capacity at EU level to respond to crises when asked by the UN to intervene. And sometimes, and this is a more controversial point, when the UN is unable to make decisions by reason of vetoes in the Security Council, what then do we do? What then can we do in terms of interventions in pursuit of peace and security? And that is a genuinely tough question to answer.
Thank you, Ben. And actually, following on, Ben, from your comments there, a question has come in that maybe, Francis, you might like to take, just in terms of the French-led military intervention in Mali and the Sahel region. And Dermot is wondering, in light of President Macron's announcement to begin winding down this military cooperation, was Ireland's decision to participate in EUTM Mali a mistake? How important is it to have non-aligned Western countries that can act as mediators in any future peace negotiations?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it was a mistake, but equally, I do take the point about, mediation and the incredibly important opportunity there is for Ireland in various scenarios. And in a way, this is linked to the previous question. And I was reflecting as Ben spoke, and I think it's an incredibly important point, if you just don't mind me referring back to it for a moment, is just to be able to respond to crisis and humanitarian crisis is so important. And I think Ireland will take varying decisions about how it wishes to engage. And Mali is an example of one form of engagement. I think we have to be very open on this, but equally, I mean, we saw with COVID in terms of crisis, the EU was, had difficulties at the beginning, but equally we have seen that the EU was founded in crisis, responded to the financial crisis in a certain sort of way, but has learned from that to deal better with the consequences of COVID. Now, I make that point to say about a crisis, whether it's a security and peace crisis or whether it's a pandemic crisis or the other humanitarian crisis, that the whole question of timely response from Ireland and being able to engage in the most appropriate way. I mean, it's a complex issue. I mean, politically, it's complex in Ireland. You get what I would consider, you get a lot of, you saw even when we were voting on various treaties, how you got all of these scares about the EU army. I mean, many of the member states have a very different view to Ireland on that and really would like to progress the EU from that point of view. Ireland has a more nuanced position and I think is more likely to be involved in peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and indeed, as the questioner says, mediation.
Great. Thank you, Frances. Geraldine, I think you wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah, thanks, Noelle. It's just that it's very topical. We discussed Mali, the role of peacekeeping in the Security Council this week. So we sat the day before yesterday, in fact, with representatives of the current Mali Transition Authority, and we discussed exactly the points that Frances and Ben have touched on in relation to peacekeeping. David's question, I think, the important point there is that we've had a coup within a coup, and we are all committed to trying to retain a stable environment. The good news in the coup in a coup on the streets of Mali is that there is currently relative stability and peace. What we want to see is that the role of the peacekeeping operation in which Ireland is participating allows the current transition authority to move towards elections, so that we keep this pathway there had been good progress since last August coup. We don't want to derail that. I heard my French colleague very clearly say that while Barkhane will be dismantled, the French role will not be diminished, it will be changed. And he made that point very clearly in the Security Council discussion, because there were clearly concerns about such a key player on the ground in such a fragile environment where large swathes of a very big country, Mali, are not under the control of the transition authority, and where terrorist activity is rife. So we had a very good discussion, and I think I'll finish up on the point that France was making very clearly at the Security Council table, that we see Mali as part of the broader G5 Sahel consideration. The stability of Africa writ large between the Sahel region and the Horn of Africa, really very, very important that we ensure that the peacekeeping capacities we have contribute to retaining that stability, because it affects the whole of the rest of Africa. So what we do in Mali has a knock-on effect for Burkina Faso, for Chad, for Niger, countries which are struggling at the best of times. So very important. And if I may, before I finish, just touch on Ben's point about the outsourcing of peacekeeping activity by the UN to regional organizations. Just add a thought, which is that this something I've become very alert to since I came onto the council. The scale of some of these operations is extraordinary. I mentioned AMISOM in my own remarks. 20,000 peacekeepers in AMISOM. There's clearly no way the European Union can lift to that level. So I think the sort of role the new peace facility will play in developing capabilities, in using a country like Ireland, our experience over 60 years is really a Rolls Royce, the gold standard of experience in peacekeeping, and people look to us to help indeed build up the peacekeeping capacity, the peace building capacity of countries in Africa and in other regions. So we may outsource, but we're still really using our own experience very directly because, as I say, the scale is just enormous. Thanks.
Thanks, Geraldine. And actually, Geraldine, I'm afraid, Francis, you wanted to come in there.
Very quickly to make 2 points. One is, Ben mentioned the Commission on the Future of the Defence Forces. I think this should be a very central part of this. It's really important because if we want to contribute, we have to keep developing the capacity. And secondly, the next crisis in terms of security and so on, that we have to think about cooperation around is going to be cybersecurity. We've seen examples of that recently. So that's one huge area where, I see it on the Committee on Disinformation. I'm actually quite shocked at many of the presentations we're getting in relation to the interferences already from various authoritarian powers into our democracies in Europe. And this is a very serious issue as well.
Thank you, Francis, for that. Just to say, folks, the questions are coming in thick and fast, and so Geraldine, I've a trio or tripartite series of questions for your good self. So I might, if I may, I might just pose them all to you in one block, if that is okay. And the first one is coming in from Ross Fitzpatrick of the IEA, and he is asking you specifically, considering the power asymmetries and the challenging dynamics of the Council, how will Ireland seek to prioritise human rights during its presidency? And then a question for you from our good friends, Con and Tara Grace, Ireland's UN youth delegates. And they are wondering do you have any thoughts on how to involve wider civil society and young people more in Ireland's day-to-day work at the United Nations? And the final question I will pose to you is from Dr. Idel Vratnuk, and she says she's a former DFA colleague of many years ago, and she is asking you, can the ambassador see how the stalling of so many urgent decisions at the Security Council by powerful members can be overcome, and if the EU and Ireland always share the same views on all issues that arise?
Wow, well, they're all, each one I could spend a long time, but if I may, I'll take them in reverse order, if that's okay. Hello, Adele, Giorich, it's a pleasure to be in touch with you again. Adele, how can we overcome the stalling by some countries at the Security Council table? I think that the key to it is essentially to build alliances and to work across, particularly the elected members. You need 9 votes at the Security Council table to deliver on anything. And if we can, for a moment, set the veto aside, you can see the maths. So you have 10 elected members. We don't always align together amongst the 10, but it's a powerful vote. And that's why that little fact check I mentioned earlier about having 5 EU member states of the Council was such a big golden era for the European Union, and why Francis and others, the questions that we've touched on about the role of the EU at the table is not insignificant in overcoming this stalling. To be on the negative side, of course, the veto, the 5 member states have a veto. A couple of them use the veto, and particularly the Russian Federation uses it more frequently than others. The US has been known to use it. The UK and France, much less. And it's over a decade ago since either the UK or France. In fact, I think 2 decades, if I'm not incorrect. The EU and Ireland, do we always agree at the Security Council? I'll give you one example of where on a specific issue, it's a little challenging in that there's a breadth of opinion on the Middle East, for example. And there, I just leave it at that. I think you all recognize that within the 27, we don't all share the same position. On the other hand, our basic traditional values and principles around human rights, international humanitarian law, that's such a big feature of what we do. The support for accountability in the International Criminal Court, another example of where we all are very supportive of traditional principles and EU values. To the youth delegates and the role of civil society, you know, we are known here in Geneva, but also in New York, as key advocates for the role of civil society. And I think you'll be aware, as youth delegates, that we have if you like, a custom designed interface with you, not just youth delegates, but with civil society in Dublin, where Minister Coveney has spoken, where the political director, Sonia Hyland in Dublin, has spoken about the role we're doing. And we are inspired by that. We discuss the issues coming up at the Security Council with that stakeholder forum, as we describe it, which is anchored at the IEA as it happens. But I will say that at the table, we are amongst the key proponents of civil society briefers. We bring them in, we advocate. Francis, we won't have time today, but I would love to have another chat with you about the gender issues you've raised, because on the Security Council, we chair women, peace and security as the thematic responsibility. And there we bring in women peace builders before every expert discussion. And on the youth aspect of that, I can say to you, just yesterday, we had an incredible Yemeni woman peace builder. And I spoke directly to the role of youth in that case, because in Yemen, 70%, that's an extraordinary figure, 70% of the population is under 25. So I made the point on behalf of the government, obviously, that we can't have discussions around the future of Yemen without the voice of youth at the table. And we will use our time building up over the next year and a half to ensure that youth voices are at the table. And then to come to Ross, look, human rights, under rights, absolutely every intervention. I can say that without any fear of contradiction that we make at the Security Council. And when we come, Ireland will be the president of the Security Council for one time only during our 2-year tenure in September. And you can rest assured that the human rights vocation will be absolutely clear in everything we do. We don't design the entire agenda. I'll finish on this. We don't design the entire agenda for September. We have the big machine, the business of the Security Council to manage. It's a high level month, so there will be a lot of activity, but you can be sure that you will be in no doubt about Ireland's human rights commitment when you see the sort of focus that we bring to all of the month of September agenda. Thanks.
As if Geraldine wasn't busy enough. Ben, I think you want to come in there, Ben, on the EU and foreign policy aspect to those questions.
Yeah, just a note of reflection. I mean, we've spoken of how the UN, you know, it has been stuck at a particular historical point in time with the 5 veto-wielding members. One might make the same argument in terms of decision-making in the EU on foreign policy, because we have a situation now where all 27 members have a veto. And we've seen some instances in the recent past where, you know, motions that should have gone through very easily with respect to human rights, with respect to China, for example, with respect to Belarus, have been held up for reasons that have nothing to do with our basic values. So there's at least a conversation to be had about how we make those decisions also at the European Union level.
And interestingly, Ben, you have actually very succinctly answered a question that came in for you as to whether the EU should consider, well, abandoning unanimity in this area, and how is this going to be spoken about in the conference on the future of Europe. Francis, did you want to come in from a European Parliament on that?
I mean, I think this is a very live conversation in Europe at present. And I think, you know, increasingly you see the problems around it. Of course, you know, people might think qualified majority voting from an Irish perspective on foreign policy, that we could possibly support that, I think. I mean, I personally think we should move in that direction. I really do. But then, of course, when it comes to taxation, people might take a very different point of view within Ireland. So, you know, at the end of the day, as when I'm discussing these things with either Minister Coveney or Minister Donoghue, it all depends, doesn't it? But I think from a human rights perspective, and, you know, in terms of engagement around the world, I can really see why. And this is a difficulty you see again and again, you know, in the EU. I see excellent reports that I would absolutely support and somebody puts in an amendment on something that really isn't that relevant, but which people are totally against, and then the report gets scuppered. And this seems, so ridiculous that either we need stricter rules in relation to that, or this in the area of foreign policy, qualified majority voting. I think it's a very live conversation, and I think it's one that will definitely be addressed in the conference in the future of Europe. And I'd love to see, what the recommendations coming from there will be, if it's adequately discussed and understood. I imagine there would be very strong support for it.
And Francis, is it maybe fair to say that the T word, taxation, has replaced the B word in terms of Brexit, perhaps in this area?
Well, I was thinking when the question was asked about different alliances. Of course, it's always about shifting alliances, isn't it? And sharing priorities in certain areas, and we see that post-Brexit as well. Post-Brexit, Ireland is having to engage with different countries within Europe and build bridges, and we obviously miss the UK and regret that decision. But again, it's about those new alliances and forging links with like-minded member states.
Absolutely. And a question, Francis, that has come in, and I think it was touched upon by Geraldine and yourself as well, about the EU being a natural ally within the multilateral system in supporting democracy, promoting human rights, fundamental freedoms, and working on gender equality and LGBTIQ plus rights. How best can the EU cooperate with those who support these freedoms? Is there a role for Ireland, and how do we do it within the EU's very own borders?
Yes, I think clearly we have a very strong role. We've had some very good experiences on many of these issues in Ireland in recent times, where we've seen a huge respect for difference and a huge respect for diversity and inclusion and equality. And I think we now have to bring those values to the international stage as much as we can. And it is, it's the old story. It is about leadership. It's about speaking out. It's about engaging with like-minded other member states, but make no mistake, and I have been quite shocked as a member within the EU of the very differing trends we're seeing, and some of the fight back on women's rights, on LGBTQI rights. We've seen really distressing initiatives and legislation, indeed, and approaches being taken in Hungary and Poland and so on. And this is where the question of what sanctions does the EU use? And, we've been accused of not being fast enough in relation to the sanctions. But I think we can play a leadership role. And you do that within the EU, you do it through a variety of mechanisms, whether it's through the Council, the Commission, and indeed the Parliament. And I think the Parliament has been very strong on challenging those issues and those moves. But don't underestimate the revisionism that we're seeing. For example, the Council themselves will not now use the phrase gender equality, because some countries are saying it's a Trojan horse for LGBTQI rights. Now, that's within the EU. Don't go beyond the EU. But look at what's happening in other countries in terms of those rights, and equally women's reproductive rights. I mean, we were slow in Ireland to really come to a point where we really understood sexual and reproductive rights and supported a proper approach to those. But these are real issues at present within the EU. So not easy. We have our own challenges within the EU. And if we want to preach to the rest of the world, we better get our own house in order to.
Absolutely. Well, very well said, Francis. Geraldine, I think you wanted to briefly come in on that point.
Exactly. Just to say, Noel, I mean, picking up on Francis' last point about getting our own house in order, there's a certain reflection here of Ireland now, slow to the table, but very much a model. And when I arrived here in New York 3 years ago, I became the chair of the Commission on the Status of Women in what was, frankly, the most challenging time, because a key player, the United States, was offside, to put it bluntly. And that reference to gender equality, frankly, was the US position as we negotiated the outcome. After 25 years after Beijing and all the hope that went with women's rights or human rights, we found ourselves with a huge player like the United States objecting to gender equality. The good news is, while they were away, they've come back. And that has helped with the pushback. But now, of course, as Francis points out, we find ourselves even sitting at the Security Council table, knowing that our EU house is not fully in order on this. You know, some of the members of the Security Council, like the Russian Federation, oppose the use of some language around sexual reproductive health rights. You can imagine in fragile contexts where the role of women, and I take Yemen, Mali, the DRC, you know, very difficult contexts where we're seeing conflict-related sexual violence, and, you know, the Ireland's instinct to support women who are victimized in that way. We've seen allegations out of Tigray recently. We just discussed that yesterday. We want to ensure that women have access to sexual reproductive health care, and that it's on the basis of a UN protected rights, as it were. So we do worry that the European Union is having second thoughts in some areas, and certainly Ireland's role as the chair of the co-chair with Mexico, indeed, of Women, Peace and Security, is to push forward and right across the agenda to promote those rights. I'm delighted to have the US back as an ally on this issue.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. And just very briefly, I think, Ben, if the connection holds up, I might give you the final word, if we can, calling the Mayo jury. Just in terms, Ben, of the Biden administration that Geraldine and Francis all spoke about, and the EU-US relationship. How do you know, if you had to rank and rate that, where do you see that in terms of strengthening the UN system, and as Geraldine said, the Americans under the Biden administration now being back on side? What would be your take on that US relationship in terms of the wider UN system?
It's absolutely central. It's the heart and foundation of the UN system, of the post-war multilateral order. It has to adapt, it has to change to new geopolitical realities, and then relations with China and Russia, Brazil, South Africa, all of these relationships have to be reflected in a new kind of UN, but founded still on those universal values that were enunciated so clearly in 1946. I think the fear is, and the challenge, frankly, is that having seen what happened in the United States happen once, in the back of our minds, we can all see it happening again. So therefore, the system has to be stronger than even the strongest individual member of the system. And I think that really is a challenge that Geraldine and her colleagues face in the UN Security Council. How can we operate when the biggest and strongest advocate of multilateralism is actually no longer at the table?
Absolutely, Ben, and I think you've hit the nail on the head in that regard, but delighted to have somebody of Geraldine's caliber and undoubted leadership lead the way for us in New York. But thank you all very much. And with that, I'm afraid we will have to bring our discussion to a conclusion. I think it's fair to say, and with the questions coming in, I always end up having to apologize to everyone that we didn't get the opportunity to bring you the questions to such a distinguished and expert panel today. Sadly, time and the clock has run against us, and that clock is very much in between Mayo, New York and Dublin, but we will get there in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. If I could just thank and pay tribute to Matthias, to Katie and all their colleagues in the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, with whom we've been working over the last number of months on this European Movement Ireland Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung collaboration. And we're really delighted with the events and webinars that we've been able to hold, and especially today in terms of such a high level and distinguished panel. And our next event will be taking place after the summer. If I could also thank my own team in European Movement Ireland. Our next event, I think, if memory serves me, is on our Slovenian presidency event with Minister Thomas Byrne, and that will be taking place in a couple of weeks. So we will be sending you all invitations to take part in that. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the audience participation, for the great questions and answers and comments that came in on social media. And a big thanks, if I may, on all of our collective parts, to thank Francis Fitzgerald, MEP, Professor Ben Tonra, and Ambassador Geraldine Byrne for so generously, expertly and comprehensively giving of their time to engage in today's fantastic and timely and important webinar. And until our next event, please do stay safe and well over the summer months. Gur míle maith guibh go léir, slán go phone, auf Wiedersehen. Thank you. Goodbye.